Is there a problem with my connection or what's going on actually?
No, we
Shailesh?
can hear you.
No, we hear you.
Okay, because I'm not getting any response, so then I don't know whether I should continue or not continue. You understanding? All right. Huh. Um, Fine. So what we'll be doing is that we'll be going back in time and we'll be looking at what we are calling industrial utopias. But the first thing that we are kind of going to discuss is the idea of utopia itself. Utopia as a word effectively means no place, and you have all probably heard this word before, as this place which is considered to be the ideal place, the place where everything is perfect, an imagined place or state of things where everything is perfect. In other words, it's an architecture of no place because there can be no place that is in many ways perfect. The root of the word utopia comes from this famous book called Utopia, which was published in 1516 by a man called Thomas More, about the political system of an imaginary ideal island nation, in which in he in many ways is really interested in ideas of redistributing the wealth, and he says that if one it was able to redistribute the wealth, you can in many ways create an ideal society where no one will starve and everyone will be happy. Right? So we were, and this kind of idea of the utopian as something that we aspire towards uh, has been an integral part of modernist thinking and especially architectural thinking ever since the beginning. Because architects also in many ways always try to frame their projects as ways to make people's lives better. In other words, architecture is always in some sense embedded with a utopian impulse. Yeah, Amhala, we want to make it better. We want to make this perfect kind of place. Right? So one of the things that we think about when we think about utopia is that utopia, which is this idea somewhere else, it's an ideal vision that doesn't exist, okay, but it's out there somewhere in the future. Okay, our desire is kind of our desires are pointing towards that space, the utopian space, that other place somewhere else. Right? And architecture gives those desires a form. It gives them some sort of building. It gives them some sort of streetscape, image, spatial sequence. It gives all our desires towards that ideal space some sort of concrete life within the worlds that we're inhabiting. If you think about that particular period of time, the 1700s to the 1900s, and we've spoken about this before, so I'm not going to kind of go over it too much. It was a time of an incredible amount of transformation in society, and that is what we end up calling the modern moment. Uh, Over here, you can see, for example, the incredible amount of kind of technological changes that are happening in the world by the introduction of steam engines, by the introduction of mechanized modes of production, mechanized modes of production of kind of textiles and mills, and of course, the way that the idea of the horizons and distances were beginning to collapse because of steam engines, because of new modes of transportation that were coming up in the world. It's an extraordinary time both in terms of technologies, and it's also an extraordinary time because now the world is more connected than it ever was before. And at the same time, with this sorts of transformation, there's a transformation in the idea of who the human being is. There is a statement that is made in 1778 in the United States Declaration of Independence that is a radical idea that says that all men are created equal. And we've spoken about this last time. Also, you have the French Revolution that talks about equality, liberty, and fraternity for all. These are extraordinary kind of moments within human society. And these also start creating ideas about what the shape of this new human society should be. What is the way in which this new human society should kind of live in the world? What is, in other words, the architecture that would be appropriate for this modern human being? What we'll be doing is that we'll be looking at two locations in Europe where these ideas began and started to take hold, and we'll be doing that through very particular architectural sorts of imaginations of utopia. Two very different ones. We'll be beginning with France and then arriving on in England. Okay. So in France, right? Extraordinarily, I mean, in 17, you have this kind of period this year. When 1784, you had this architect called Boulez. Okay, now this is a project that has become iconic and has become extremely famous as being one of the first modern utopian architectural imaginations. Boulez was an architect who was really interested in the authority that comes from neoclassical architecture. This is the design, I mean, obviously a drawing of a imagined kind of library that he has projected. And the library, of course, is, and look at this library, it's a large public space. So this imagination as of a library as the place where the public meets, she's so deeply embedded in this imagination, and the architecture itself evokes the classicism of Greek. Like you can see Greek columns, and you can see the sort of vaulted arch, etc., etc. That refers to the formality of classical architecture. And this is 1784. But most famously, he's very well known for this particular project, which is a cenotaph for Newton. Now, Newton is one of the classic figures of the Enlightenment, because it's because of Newton that we get our imagination of man in the world began to transform very, very dramatically. So Newton and his scientific sort of thought was a very important part of the Western Enlightenment. Right? So Boulez is projecting a cenotaph, or a place that commemorates Newton after he's dead. Okay, so this is his design for that, and as you can see, it's this perfect sphere, a Newtonian form or a Platonic form, this perfect sphere that is then held like literally on its tip on the ground, with these large sorts of rings that are there on all sides of it, and these terraces that rise up. The scale is enormous. Okay, and he has these trees, closely spaced cypress trees, that are encircling it, and cypress as a tree is representative of death in Greek and Roman cultures. You climb up these massive sets of stairs on both sides, and then you arrive upon this first terrace, and it's from the first terrace that you enter, sorry, second terrace, that you begin to enter this large space that's within. And this large space, this huge spherical space, has actually has these pinpricks across their entire internal surface that replicates the stars at night from within. So when you enter it in the day, you can see the night sky outside, okay? And it inverts in the next day at night, right? Where the inside then becomes a sphere that glows with this enormous light fixture that is hanging in the middle of the project. You can see here the obsessions with light, with shadow, with the universe, with stars, a certain relationship that Boulez is trying to create of this new modern man with the universal forces of the world through the deployment of classical architecture. Another image of the same kind of project, an image during the day. The next character who is very interesting for us to think about in industrial era France is a person called Claude Ledoux. Okay. And Ledoux was also an architect and did a lot of work in France, but he's actually very, very well known for an ideal city that he imagined. Now, this idea of the ideal city, a perfect sort of kind of spatial configuration of society, कि society ऐसे होना चाहिए और उसका जो architecture है वो ये ऐसे होना चाहिए, right? This is an example of that. This is his plan for the salt works at Chaux. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's a place which is beside a forest, where the trees were going to be logged to be used for the production of salt. This is the plan that he has, and it's classic kind of diagram of societal order, housing on the outskirts like that, forming a ring, and the center obviously taken up by the administrative, etc., and the factory buildings, etc. Right? This is part of it was built, most of it was not built. This is the full city plan, perfect circle. The center has the factory, the outskirts have the housing with gardens that encircle it. These are some of the drawings that you find that Laddu had done. And in this, you will see there's a similar, like if you think about Boule, there's a similar interest in geometries, classical geometries and certain kinds of typologies that are being used for different kinds of programs. This, for example, is the long barn of the factory. This is the director's home with its perfect symmetry. Sorry, this is the, and it has some water body that comes in. I've forgotten what. Sorry, I've forgotten which building this is. All these plans are available online. Uh, this is I mean, I found this to be a really interesting thing, because one of the things that they try and do in these ideal cities is that they try and project a new structure for society itself. So they believe that through the transformation of space, the society, the space within which people live, people's lives will change, and people can be then, a societal structure will also change. So they are trying to, in many ways, in these ideal cities, transform society through architecture, something that we continue to and have the legacy of, even in the way that we teach architecture. This is a very strange and interesting building. This is called the Oikema, and it is and in the city of Shows, this would enforce heterosexuality, foment desire, and develop the powers of population. So even the sexual lives of people were meant to be controlled by the factory itself. And as you can see, this building is shaped like a penis in plan, with like a salon at the tip, and all these rooms on both sides for, well, sexual activity. So it was some sort of brothel that is also being imagined as part of the ideal city, and is of course worked out the section of it as well, which kind of has the penis at the upper level and the living quarters at the lower level. So this is the Oikema and the lower spaces, right? Only part of it was built. This is the portion that is currently there. This is the house of the director that was built for the salt works. Okay. Also, that was Boule, who built the cenotaph for Newton. Then you had Laddu, who built that strange ideal city of Shaw. But perhaps the person who has become one of the most famous names in the idea of ideal cities is this man called Fourier, Charles Fourier, who proposed this word that is called a phalanstery, and we'll come to that a little later. But who was Fourier? Fourier was a socialist thinker. He is what is called a utopian socialist. In many ways, they really wanted to radically transform the very structure of society itself, restructure the relationship between man and nature, man and each other, between class, within the idea of work, everything. Right? And he believed that the form of economic, political, and social life should be altered to fit the inherent passions of the individual. So he made a categories of people. He said that there are kind of different kinds of categories of people, and each of these different categories of people desire different things. And they can all be then kind of slotted in these different sorts of places. And then the kind of work that they do and the kind of life that they lead will be based on that particular personality type. So he literally did cataloging of all the people on earth. I mean, of people. He then started kind of imagining what kind of ideal city would be there that all of this society could be housed within. This is what ended up being called the phalanstery. Now the phalanstery is a ideal city / building. Okay, these apartment buildings that would wrap around a series of central courtyards, and the amount of money that you would have would also determine your place within this entire building. Okay. The central spaces, like in Shaw's, were places for common facilities, dining halls. There would be common cooking. There would be. It was a sort of ideal society that he was projecting. Right? So and like in most ideal cities, there were people who were privileged and there were people who are not. The phalansteries and Fouriers are notoriously anti-Semitic, for example. They were not, and those also find their representation within this architecture too. He had devotees. None of these kind of phalansteries were actually built, but Fourier's ideas and Fourier's imaginations of the ideal world that we need to live in were extremely influential. And there was one such phalanstery that was actually built There is a video on this phalanstery that is available online on YouTube. Maybe later on at the end of the class, I'll just post a link to it, and you all can watch it. Actually, it was part of this presentation. I don't know where it is gone. Okay, anyway, okay, you can watch that video a little later on. It gives you a certain idea about the extent of utopian thinking and the distance it was willing to go to be able to shape people's lives. So that was France, and we saw Boulez, Ledoux, and Fourier, and to some extent the Godin's Familystery. That is one story. The other story that we thought we'll do is the story of what's happening across in England, in Great Britain. Okay. An important character for that is another utopian socialist called Robert Owen. Okay. These are things that are happening parallelly in both these countries, and you have to understand that these are the two countries that are at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. So a lot of what they are reacting to comes from what is happening to the cities, given the concentration of factories and labor within the important urban centers. Okay, so as against sorry, I seem to have some sort of issue here. Wait 1 minute. Okay. Can you guys hear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead without speaker. There's something wrong with my speaker here. So Robert Owen was a textile manufacturer, and he eventually started managing a large textile mill that was called New Lanark in Scotland. And he was really interested in thinking about social structure and architecture, social structure and spatial planning. Okay. He went to America, tried to evolve a socialist community there. He also, which of course might have failed, he came back to England. In 1813, he published this essay, which is called A New View of Society, or Essay on the Principle of the Formation of the Human Character, in which he said that the correct formation of people's characters called for placing them under the proper environmental influences. So here you can immediately see a certain idea to say that, yeah, these people can be saved or people can be made better through making space that will make them better. So there's a moral way, the morality of people could be transformed through architecture. You could and that idea that we can change people through architecture is deeply embedded in most utopian societies, because they call for a radical reimagination of the human being through the making of, well, cities. So Owen too, like Fourier, came up with ideas of ideal cities. These he called the villages of unity and mutual cooperation. And this is the plan for them. You can see very similar to Shaw's that we saw earlier. These villages were supposed to be placed at a certain distance from one another. The agricultural fields around each of these villages, you can see this kind of plots over here, would be then owned and would be tilled by the community itself. There was this idea of collective living that was very central to Fourier's imagination of the ideal villages, and it's apparent in just the name that he gives, right? Agricultural and manufacturing village of unity and mutual cooperation. Okay. So this this is a plan of such a village again, which similar to Shaw has this kind of square perimeter blocks, low rise, ground plus 3, ground plus 4 storied, and you have the central block as the place that the common facilities lie. You have also have blocks on the outside where also other common facilities for collective gathering, for food, for all of these can be taken care of. Right? So it's obviously imagined that this was going to call for a radical restructuring of society itself. A radical restructuring that would, in many ways, try and equalize the worker and the owner. It was in this sort of ideal way that, oh, everyone will work very happily with each other, unity and mutual cooperation. Right? This is of course its strength as well as its great weakness, because it's these ideas never really had any kind of concrete relationship with the realities of what the cities were about. That's part of their charm, and that is also part of their danger, that they seem to be removed from the world. Because this is a time when London itself is undergoing dramatic transformations. So while Robert Owen is kind of doing this, he's actually reacting to what's happening to the city of London, most famously represented in what is in the novels of Charles Dickens that you all might have read. His famous books being Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, etc. And a lot of them evoke a particular kind of idea of London, which seems like this: a city that is overrun with people, that is crowded. People have kind of finding desperate ways of living. It's a crumbling city.
Rohan,
Uh,
Rohan, sorry. No, sorry. I was just thinking when you were talking about France as well, there is a
yeah,
radical change happening in cities in France also, because
absolutely.
they've just come out of, or they're still in the process of coming out of the so-called French Revolution, and Haussmann's idea of what the city is has already started taking shape. So similar photographs of Paris, which are shot by Melville and other guys, showing the kind of destruction that is caused in the process of reconstruction of the city, and the kind of city that then we get is this kind of very ordered city which has large avenues, large vistas, but it also has things like, I think somewhere we discussed this, it has drainage systems, it has new sewerage systems, it has ways of sort of the whole idea of municipality takes shape, you know. So these are just some of the things that are parallelly happening there. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, absolutely. So this is the way London is. Na? London is also a place where there are cholera epidemics. Like, this is a famous map made by John Snow in
Yeah.
1854, which shows the relationship of kind of drainage systems and the outbreak of cholera. So what's happening is that the city is seen as a place of vice, as a space of disease, as a space that is extremely kind of dangerous, and also a place where people come and live in the most horrific kind of places, as sort of spaces. These are images of New York, actually, done by Jacob Riis in a book that's called How the Other Half Lives, that was published in 1890. Okay. At the same time, you also have a book that is called How the Poor Live, that was published in 1889, which is looking at the lives of people in London. And like the title of this, if you can read it, it's How the Poor Live in Horrible London. So the city is seen as a space of extreme danger, similar to like how we were looking at in these images. And at the same time, you have the kind of world that's transforming rapidly with the with the I guess invention and the creation of these incredible machines. This is a famous painting by J.M.W. Turner, where you can see, it's called the Fighting Temeraire, where you can see this large ship, which is at the back, which is an old-fashioned sailboat that is being tugged along with this ship that is there in front, which is obviously running on steam because you see the smoke coming on. So you're able to see in this image a certain idea of modernity. A smaller, more powerful machine is pulling this gigantic weight behind it. There's also, of course, the way in which the painting itself has been painted, a certain tumultuous movement of wildness that's there. This is a painting that is also about a steamboat at a harbor's mouth, and here you can see the boat has almost completely disappeared into this whirlwind of water and wind. Right. Another famous painting of his is one that is looking at the railway line, and this is called Rain, Steam and Speed, the Great Western Railway. And over here, the train is literally coming out of this, like, wildness. Like this train is literally like the storm in nature, and you see this train kind of rushing, heading along this bridge that's there on the right side. A tiny little boat is existing in the kind of water that's happening below. And if you look really, really close at this portion, at the bottom right, you'll see there's a little like a rabbit here that is also kind of fighting to stay alive with the onslaught of the coming train. So while at one time you have the seductions and the speed and the incredible violence of the Industrial Revolution, creating new materials, new societies, there's a great deal of speed and violence in the air, and also a different kind of beauty. You have at the same time a longing for the rural, a longing for the landscape, a longing for the perfect kind of life, the desperate need that we have to be able to control all this wildness. So if you think about Robert Owen's these drawings and these sorts of imaginations, they lie in a marked contrast to Turner's painting, but they don't, and they are part of the same sort of idea of what is happening to cities, what is happening to society at that particular time, which is called Victorian London. Right? Now, let's try and think about what is also happening to us in India at that time. This is Victorian England. The Raj has the in 1857, of course, we have the great first war of independence, where the Raj then becomes we get ruled directly by the British Raj. Okay. And this is the time when England or Europe, England actually wants to in many ways show its incredible length and breadth, and the fact that it's the center of industrial production. It has an empire that stretches from one end to the other. This is the kind of an event that happens in 1851 that is called the kind of Great Exhibition of 1851, for which this building is built, which is called the Crystal Palace. Okay. Now it's in the Crystal Palace whose architecture of which becomes representative of the industrial era because of its use of glass and steel, that we are able to see the beginnings of something that can be called a modernist idiom of architecture. Within this grand Crystal Palace are all the amazing things that Britain has within its empire. So you have a portion for India, a portion for England, a portion for Africa. Jewels, different things from around these places are gotten to England and displayed for the awe, to make the kind of British public extremely kind of like, they go, what an amazing place this is, right? What an amazing empire also that we have. But it's also the place that we see the first models for public housing being displayed. So it's in the Great Exhibition of 1851 that architect called Henry Roberts designs ideal working class housing for the city. So it's interesting to think about that, no? That this is happening around it. And in the 1851 exhibition that looks something like this, okay, there's a portion that is set aside and has stuff like this. There's a portion that is set aside where you have model houses for the laboring classes exhibited in that space, sponsored by the Prince Albert. And in this, you see the beginning of what then becomes such a common housing type, the apartment building. In the plan, you look at it, if you look at the plan closely, you'll see that actually there are 4 apartments, 2 on the ground floor, 2 on the upper floor. You have a central staircase block that's here at the center. You come inside 1 living room, 1 room, 2nd room, 3rd room, and a little vestibule and probably a bathroom that's tucked away in these edges. And this idea that society, that as a society, we can provide for better housing for the laboring classes emerges out of all of these different desires. The desire for an ideal world where a paternalistic kind of guy, in this case an industrialist, says that, listen, I need to take care of my workers, therefore I will put together an ideal city where I will house them in a good place, right? So he designs these villages of unity and mutual cooperation. Okay. It also comes from the fear that something like this says that, yeah, this is cholera that's happening in these old cities, and these diseases don't know any boundaries. Yeah, these diseases can overspill. These diseases are happening because living conditions are really bad, and these diseases can even affect me as an upper class person. Therefore, I need to do something about this. I need to provide housing that can be healthy for the working classes themselves. You have to also remember that Karl Marx has also written his Communist Manifesto well before this time. Okay. So you have this as the first example of an architect who is evolving housing types to really address the issues of the working classes. These are some of the ideal dwellings that were built. It's an exhibition model. In the exhibition, model dwellings were built, and many such housing estates were then begun in England itself. You'll realize that that even in India after the plague in the 1890s, you had a similar attempt to start thinking about housing many of the working classes of Bombay within kind of apartment buildings with enough light and ventilation to improve their living conditions. So yeah, this is good. Yeah, it's fine. So what you have, so while this is happening, while you're really thinking about in the city, we need to make people's lives better by providing them good housing. The great exhibition, of course, becomes a place where we are discussing what good housing is. You also have this retreat into the rural, because the city is seen as a place of industry, and the city are seen as places that have destroyed humanity's relationship with nature and with the divine. You also have a group of architects that is proposing its opposite, that is saying we need to reject the industrial, we need to go back to the past, we need to find the truth in history. So this is a book that's written by an extremely important architect, a person called John Ruskin, and it's a book that's called The Seven Lamps of Architecture, where and this he says are the lamps of architecture. They give architecture light. So let's just look at what each of them are. Right? The first is sacrifice, a dedication of man's craft to God. Okay, truth, handcrafted and honest displays of material as against industrial. So handcrafted is truthful. Power. Okay, building should be thought in terms of their massing and reach towards the sublimity of nature. You see in the fact that buildings now have become ways in which man can commune with nature. Okay. Beauty, aspiration towards God expressed in ornamentation drawn from nature, his creation. Life, building should be made by human hands. Memory, building should respect the culture from which they have developed. Obedience, no originality for its own sake, but conforming to the values among existing English values, particularly expressed through the English early decorated Gothic as the safest choice of style. You have to think about this sort of idea कि यार हमारा जो हमें truth चाहिए, हमें beauty चाहिए, हमें divine चाहिए, and you have to look at where's that amazing images. These images of Turner, these images of Rees, these images of London in Victorian England, and then you know where this sort of desire for finding your truth in history, finding your truth in beauty, finding your truth and a certain idea of beauty, not Turner's beauty, but rather a more historicized, like, pleasant beauty, if you want to call them that, and of course the idea that the human being has been corrupted by industrial systems and need to find the craft again. And even today in India, you find so many people talking in exactly that language, right? About the romantic imaginations of craft as a way in which we can fight the anonymity of industrial civilization. One of the people who's highly influenced by Ruskin is a person called William Morris, and he also writes a book that is called The News from Nowhere. I'm using News from Nowhere as one of the end pieces because it really echoes back to the idea of utopia or no place, nowhere. This is the frontispiece of the book, or the cover of the book, and just read it. Na? This is the picture of the house by the Thames to which the people of the story went. Year after follows the book itself, which is called The News from Nowhere. But look at that image with its kind of border, with its kind of pitched roofs, its rusticated facades. There is an evocation of a rural ideal past, a rural space where everything is much sweeter and nicer and not ravaged by the crap of industrial society. It's a novel, so it's a story in which this person falls asleep after kind of meeting the Socialist League and finds himself in a future based on common ownership and democratic control of the means of production. There is no private property, no big cities, no authority, no monetary system, no divorce, no courts, no prisons. It's that kind of agrarian idyllic society. And William Morris also then builds a home for himself, which is called the Red House. You can see in this architecture an evocation of an ideal past somewhere in the red brick, in the pitched roof, in the high kind of pitch of the roofs, and also in the interior spaces, which are full of these kinds of crafts, textile crafts, carpets, etc. In fact, William Morris then goes on to become a very important designer of um, kind of these textiles and fabrics, etc. This movement is called the arts and crafts movement, the arts and the crafts movement. This is a very important kind of tendency of modernism that has very often been ignored by most people who think that modernism is Le Corbusier. Uh, Along with this desire for us to dissolve ourselves in the speed of modernity, which of course Corbusier and all do, you also have a reaction against it, a reaction to be able to reconfigure history, to be able to really talk about the domestic, to talk about family, to talk about the rural as also a part of the great modern movement. And the arts and craft movement stays alive until the First World War happens. Some extremely beautiful work happens because of the arts and crafts movement. And you have a similar arts and crafts movement that happens in Europe as well, I think in Vienna, in Brussels, in these cities, you have people trying to revive older craft traditions and form a sort of softer, sweeter, and more what they thought beautiful imagination of living in the city, living in the industrial era. I think I'm going to end there. Actually, I think we'll move Ebenezer Howard to next week. Is that fine? What do you guys think, Jin and Shirish?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because anyway, we are like 40 minutes into the lecture, so it's long enough.
Yeah.
So what we have looked at today, just to kind of give you a quick revision, because I understand that there's just too much information that very often happens in these classes. What we have looked at today are actually two spaces, England and France, that are during the wild growth of industrialization, trying to find alternatives to the way people can live. In France, we looked at the ideal cities of Ledoux and Fourier, really primarily the phalanstery. I'll just show it to you once more so you may remember it. This is Chaux, which is one imagination that's there, and there's the phalanstery. This is what we looked at in France. While in England, we looked at the tendency of kind of architects to look inwards and to look towards the rural. We looked at the arts and crafts movement, which is most best represented by the Red House. But we also looked at ways in which ideal kind of housing was emerging within spaces like the Great Exhibition as these first housing projects that were ever built for working class people in the world. I think that's summarizes what we spoke of today. Anything else, Jin and Shirish, that I missed out or whatever you want to add?
No, I'm just thinking that that this is also very much in tandem with the kind of scientific discoveries that are happening. So the idea of the ability to be able to build that crystal glass palace is also novel in that sense. You know, glass is used in a very different way, but to create a building which is completely out of kind of glass clad is something which is very novel, and it requires a different kind of industrial sort of production. It's the way the steel is also molded. It's all those things now start to come in play, and these lessons are then carried forward into many of the other kind of colonies also. I think that is something which we should remember. So and we will if you're traveling across the country, you will be you will suddenly find a building which is using slender kind of metal kind of columns, which are actually much older, which are imported and things like that. So it's great to discover some of these evidences. Yeah. I'm also reminded of another book, Rohan. It's called The Grammar of Ornament by Owen Jones, which was which was a collection of plates that were made by this gentleman, and he's looking at various sort of, again, the idea of beauty, and searching that, not only, I mean, searching that in the Middle East, in India, and he catalogs the different ways in which, through of course, looking at fabrics and pottery and things like that, but he creates these abstract kind of plates. He plates them down as this is what the idea of the ornament is. That's another. It's available. PDF is there free for anyone. It's called the Grammar of Ornament. Worth looking at. Yeah.
Should I unshare? Stop sharing?
Yeah.
I had a question.
Yes.
So when we're talking about utopia, so basically, is utopia, the ideas of utopia only into the architectural aspect, where you say that it's you have to create ideal living conditions for people? Because if you're looking at France, and where they say that people should be separated on the basis of the economic status that they have, so that wouldn't be something that is ideal, right? Like, if you're segregating different types of classes and then making them live like separately. I didn't understand the idea of utopia, like what exactly is the idea.
No, I don't think you can. I think the idea of utopia doesn't only talk about architecture. Actually, it is in almost every imagination of the ideal, there is a certain way in which space is configured. So society is being imagined in a new way, and therefore the space that society lives in will have to also change. So there's a close relationship between the way that society is reimagining and the way that space is being reimagined for it. Sometimes it is believed, and that is where the big kind of question comes in, is that society, that you can change the way people are by changing the architecture that they are living in. In other words, if I have to make somebody better, I can change the architecture in which they are living and they will become better.
So we're also changing the mindset of the people on a larger.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, that is the idea, that through the change in space, their mindset will change. I don't know how successful that is, and I don't know whether that is even something that we should aim for, but that is really what the idea is. कि यार लोग है ना वो, we can change them by the way that we design spaces for them. You'll see that in so many architecture like theses देख तू कितने सारे theses. So many theses are really talking about कि we'll change the spaces of people and then people's behavior will change. I think it's a little too much to ask for. Even in your own kind of AD projects, that is a question that very often will be part of it. Shantanu, you in particular.
Yeah. I have a question, Johan.
Yeah.
So this utopian idea, does it involve pure forms like a Gothic column or a sphere or a, like, you getting my point?
एक minute. I'm just trying to get my earphones in place so that I can hear you better. हाँ अभी बोल शांतनु. What were you saying?
This utopian idea, this ideology. I'm not talking about the politics. I'm talking about how forms are being conceived in this utopia. So it involves the state of how making pure forms, like the Gothic column, for instance. Does it implies that?
Yeah, there is an implication. Now this is I think it's a very good question that you are asking. कि ये है जो प्योरिटी है फॉर्म का जो फंडा है ना कि that in its sense it's related to what the conversation that we were having earlier also, that the idea of the institution is a place that every society has some desire about what it wants to become. It's like kuch hai, there's something that is there, and that is always imagined as a sort of, and that is represented largely in the institutions that we build. So we build schools, or we build town halls, or we build these things because we believe that those represent our value system. Education is important, healthcare is important, governance is important. Now those spaces are imagined as the architecture of those spaces is said to, in some senses, represent our value system. It's supposed to represent purity, our value system at its most distilled. Now, what happens with with that particular period of time is that in France and in England, they are also looking for that place where their truth or where their beauty lies. They are looking कि कहाँ है हमारे history में, where is that kind of place? So they find it in, they say that they find it in classical architecture. And what they then do is that they then try and purify even the classical architecture into its most pure forms.
Yeah.
So they then evoke the neoclassical. That's why they call it neoclassical. तो इसलिए वो जो Greek columns forms जो होते हैं ना, they are going back to that because they think that their own history and their own kind of value system is best represented by that particular architecture. So even when Boulez is designing that cenotaph for Newton, that extraordinarily enormous globe that's there, na, he's evoking it not only as an idea of the globe in the sky, but also this idea of the pure form, which represents a certain kind of divine, I guess you could call it, the sphere.
So Rohan, I want to ask a question, and this is for the students as well. Do you think that free market is a utopian idea? Have you guys heard of? Are you aware of the term free market? You're aware, something you know about what the idea of free market is, right? So there is such a thing which is called free market, and do you think that is a utopian idea? I'm asking you this question because while there are ideas of utopia in as partial kind of sort of ways, there is also a utopianism of social processes. Yeah. So and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Yeah. When when the big globe is built, you have to also understand or built or imagine, we have to understand that it is coming from a kind of social process of a time that leads someone to think about a space of a certain kind. Yeah. And similarly, in case of what happens in France, what is happening in England, there is the idea that the world can change as a social sort of relationship. Yeah, and towards that change, there are many people who are bringing in spatial kind of thoughts. Okay, so for example, you can also think about the fact that someone is now thinking of housing for labor as a very kind of social, what do you say, a social expression. Its manifestation in the model that we saw as a house is the physical kind of way it takes shape. They're both what do you say, sort of related, not necessarily entirely, what do you say, they're not necessarily entirely successful either, and that negotiation is a constant process between utopia and reality in many ways. Sorry, this is yeah.
I don't think you can escape the idea of the utopian,
Yeah.
It's so deeply embedded in.
But there's another question actually. Sorry.
Well.
There's another question. Is formation of a utopia always a process of exclusion? Meaning that when you imagine that this is utopia, you're always imagining it for someone, and you are actually thinking, and that is where the entire sort of idea of nation state, the idea of who is the public,
who belongs, who doesn't belong,
who doesn't belong, all these questions.
I think Suresh, this idea of the exclusion is utopia and exclusion. I think it is to the extent that there are these ideals of the one who imagines ki this is a utopia society, or this is my idea of an utopian world. So there are some things that he consider are that are fit to be in it, and then there are things that are not fit, which are so yeah, I think it is more of an exclusion process.
No, yeah. It's like, who's this?
Surabhi.
Surabhi.
also I feel that when we think about the idea of utopia on a very large scale, or like today that we saw the first one, it was more of an experiential idea of utopia. I mean, but the second one actually talked about the city and like bringing change in or making it a better place. And how large the scale is. I mean, if you think about a city, then the assumptions that are made by a person or who is actually desiring about it or trying to plan it are maybe more like the some assumptions that are like some assumption the assumption in that scale may be more, and whereas if you plan on a small scale in maybe a neighborhood, then you know the place more better. The level of assumption may be like slightly less, and that's where I think this exclusion wala thing comes in, because in a larger case maybe some things are getting excluded, you don't even think about them, or maybe you don't know. So yeah, some things I think that is related.
Yeah. Is the formation of our nation a utopian idea? The idea of the nation, do you think there is an embedded utopian sort of sense in it? And we started with the constitution, remember, when we were looking at the Indian constitution. Do you think that there is an embedded utopian ideal there?
About this, I think I can also answer I can relate the question about the free market. Is free market utopian? Is it a utopian setup? So our constitution has these kind of rights, or special what do we say, special places, not places, but reservations kind of thing, not in terms of those SC or NT reservations, but it protects people in a way. So I think it is rather than excluding those people, it is somehow trying to bring an improvement, something like that, rather than just excluding this one category.
Okay. Why I'm asking you is that the idea of housing for all. For example, if I now distill it down to large programs, which is what I think Vallavi was mentioning. What is this idea of housing for all, and how does that actually manifest? How does that actually translate? What are the processes by which you are able to? There is a utopian ideal in it, right? You can't, and in that sense, I feel that we the society is built on utopian ideals. Rohan, sorry, if you want to.
No, I don't want to say anything. I'm just listening to you. I'm actually listening to you. Yeah. No.
The society is built on utopian ideals, isn't it? We constantly, and especially as architects or people who are in the kind of special discipline, we are constantly engaging with this question of what is the future, what is our role, and our role always is in making a better space, right? That is always the concern, and then a better space for whom? Yeah, and a better space. How do we make that a better space, and why do we make it in a certain way? So the idea of utopia is not necessarily only projecting a better space, but it also comes with a sense of responsibility. Yeah, and I think that is where our sort of what do you say, confusions lie. So it's not only in the great plan which is presented, it is also in the way that plan is then translated, and many a times there are a lot of conflicts there. Yeah.
Also, there's the ye hota hai na, that it becomes a big kind of conflict between value systems also.
Yeah.
I may believe that this is better, and then somebody else believes that is better. Na? Then you're stuck with that sort of debate in terms of like who are you to decide that this is for me? तो होता कौन है? और यार मेरी बात तो सुनी नहीं तूने, तू होता कौन है मुझे बताने के लिए कि this is good for you. And it's a little like a parent and child issue. So in the earlier ideas of utopia na, that were there, they were like one that the parent is there. मैं बाप हूँ, मुझे मालूम है, तुझे आता नहीं ना, तुझे पढ़ा लिखा नहीं है ना तू, तो मैं बताऊंगा तुझे कि this is the right way of living. Okay? At some point, the child looks up and says, "यार तू होता कौन है यार? मुझे पूछा तूने?" And actually, that is a very interesting debate, because now you have this problem, right? That if the utopia was a place that everyone agreed to, because that is utopia, na? Then why did one person have to decide it for somebody else? Who gave that person the authority? And this is the great contradiction of architecture, and it's one of the great, because architect का problem क्या है मैं बताऊं तुम लोगों को, कि एक मेजर प्रॉब्लम ये है कि वो बात करते हैं अबाउट फ्रीडम, इक्वालिटी, जस्टिस, क्या जो चाहे बोलो, okay? But actually the way that the power actually is, power actually is with forces like the market, forces like money, right? Comes from there. So the big issue that architects have is, like, at one level they are thinking that they are doing things for good of mankind, but they know that that's actually their arm is only being strengthened by people with lots of power. So they live in perpetual guilt. कि मैं करूँ तो क्या करूँ, हाय. That becomes the kind of, it's the general status of architects. This perpetual feeling of, like, not being able to really achieve what they are hoping to achieve, because, or they completely sell out. They're like, यार ये सब ना फालतूगिरी है, talking about better world, talking about participating, वो सब फालतूगिरी है. मैं तो सिर्फ यार business करने वाला हूँ. मैं ना जो builder बोलेगा मैं बनाऊंगा यार, मेरा क्या जाता है. That is a complete denial of any sort of aspiration or hope that is embedded in architecture. So क्या होता है कि you are caught between this shit. I mean, honestly put, at one level you have the utopian kind of idea that how better world, etc., but you know that you are basically a little stuck in that choice. You don't have the clients who are going to give you that opportunity. And on the other hand, you have the client who's telling you, यार मैं फालतू गंदा सा building बनाऊंगा. Okay, I will make horrible places for people to live in. I will make them in the most terrible material. I will make sure that you have no light and ventilation, but I'll need an architect to sign that drawing. You'll do it for me. Architect sir, for sure, baby. So
Nishanti. Yeah.
Yeah. So that is actually one of the great burdens of architecture. Actually, it's something that we have to be able to face and be able to resolve.
Nishanti?
Nishanti wants to say something.
Yeah, I had a bit of a question. So, like, my understanding of why there was so much like talk about the utopia within that time period was because of the rapid industrialization. People were saying things that they had never really thought were possible, and that's why they sort of had this idea of the utopia. And I was wondering if you could talk about it in the context of the 21st century. Like, I mean, I'm kind of relating it to what I know in the media that I'm familiar with, and everything that I've so far consumed and seen relating to this is all dystopian. And especially in the context of, like, this year in particular that's been so, like, tumultuous, as you said. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that.
It's an excellent question, because actually it's something that we are thinking of playing around with for our Kamala Raheja Memorial Lecture Series this year. Just the first conversation that we had yesterday. So we are thinking of calling it the Apocalypse Manifesto, just for the fun of it. But it's really something that we already saw the kind of beginnings of the beginnings of the end, if you want to call them that, with ecological crisis looming high, with the world kind of dividing itself even more into its camps, with violence in the air perpetually at all scales, especially at the scale of the city. If you look at what is happening in Delhi, what happened in Delhi a few months back, and of course what is happening in the world, the idea of this crisis seems to be perpetually escalating. And of course, what COVID seems to have done is that it just kind of placed everything out of whack, and we have a completely new situation here. New crisis has emerged, and it seems as if what we really need right now is an ability to recalibrate not just our practices as architects, but really our practices as citizens too. To start thinking about what is the idea of betterness that we engage with in today's kind of India for us, and world otherwise. I think it's a time. I think it's time to ask fundamental questions, more kind of what can be called first questions, or like the fundamental question concerning what is good, what is bad. Okay, really simple, like dumb questions like that. Whom do we represent? Whom are we forced to represent? What is beauty? What is good architecture? I think those are the sorts of questions that we have to begin to think about, because I think you're right at many levels. Since I was just talking yesterday. I was saying that has there ever been a manifesto? You know what a manifesto is, no? Manifestos are things that political parties write saying that this is what they're going to achieve, right? And architects have written manifestos for the past, 150 years. कि मैं constructivist manifesto, futurist manifesto, Chachu manifesto, एक के बाद एक लिखा है उन्होंने. But they set out a path saying कि यार, this is what we believe in, this is what our future should be about, this is the way people should be able to kind of live, and this is our role in it. They were kind of blatant about it. That entire kind of manifesto writing system or whatever idea just disintegrated in the 60s and the 70s, because we were like, who are you to write? Main to hota kaun hai yaar, ye wo, what is this idea you have of a future? All that shit, don't talk in hawa. All of that stuff happened. And so with that kind of turn, I think what architects did is that they even said that theek hai yaar, there's no point in thinking about betterness, let's just work with what is there now. Jo builder bolega main karunga, in other words. I think it has become now increasingly of value to really start thinking in some sense of the utopian again, especially in a time like this when we have a situation that is asking us to rethink many of the things that we've taken for granted. I don't think we have had one. I think it's important to kind of begin the steps of writing one, actually, to be honest, is what I think. And Shirish and Janella may correct me if I'm wrong, but has there ever been a kind of manifested, let's say, an articulated manifesto for architecture in India?
I don't
know the attempt. So architecture? No, I'm not sure. No.
But the sort of housing programs have written that to some degree.
Housing is housing. I'm talking about architecture. That's a different matter entirely.
I'm thinking.
I would say maybe the India report, maybe the India report was one.
Yeah,
I would say, but I don't think there has been.
Yeah.
I mean, sporadically, to some degree, Charles Correa's this thing, what is it called?
The New Landscape.
The New Landscape, okay, is actually a manifesto in many ways, and it's very, very contextual.
It's a fabulous manifesto.
Similarly, Doshi, but like Doshi's never put together it as a manifesto. I mean, he mentions it in his that Paths Uncharted, but he's never really come out with it as a kind of a pan-Indian manifesto. I have not seen. I'm thinking of other practices. I don't know. Maybe Auroville maybe has ideas of. Putting together a manifesto. Yeah, somebody, Sarth, you want to say something?
So this idea of philanthropy, where the first line I read was 500 to 2,000 people coming together and working for mutual benefit. So just by just reading the first line, I had this thought of Auroville. This is one of the prime concepts there. But then when I don't remember the name of the guy, the industrialist who is drawn that farmlands outside the
Robert Owen.
Yeah. So it has this one sense of administration over those lands, which seems to be, according to me, contradicting the concept a bit. So this is what was going on in my mind.
Yeah.
No, good point.
Sarth, you're very, very, very true. I mean, I had Rohan, I had a little piece of note that I found on some Utopia lecture that I did some ages back. Okay.
Seriously.
And there's one line that I've written here, that freedom of market has to be guaranteed by law, authority, force, and in extreme conditions by violence. Okay. So you are right. There is that sense of because again you have to exclusion, right? In some way, not everybody is allowed, somebody is allowed, that boundary is there, who polices that boundary? So all these questions spring up, and in that sense, are we then surrounded by actually degenerate utopias, like they like completely sort of like what is this idea of utopia where I need to enter into a to check me completely, okay, do a policing, and then I enter inside and I say, wow, such a great space it is, like Disneyland is, or like many other sort of things are. I'm also sort of thinking about, sorry, Shantanu, Shantanu says it.
I have a comment to make on the existence of manifestos. I think for designers, manifestos are kind of dangerous because it includes to thinking like while doing something, you tend to think in ideal ways of doing it, and it I think hampers creativity because it doesn't allow you to take risks, and it also avoids kind of accidents that may happen in the process you are going, that you may also discover something new. You can also try it.
But what there's it but the advantage of a manifesto is also that it makes things articulate. It allows us to think things, it allows things to be communicated to each other. It allows for community to be formed, like all language does. So what manifestos do, I mean, I agree with you that all of those dangers do exist. Manifestos very often have been the most danger. In fact, the most reviled of all architectural shit is the manifesto.
Yeah, okay. I mean, Hitler had a manifesto, by the way.
Yeah. He had a utopia too.
He had a utopia too.
He had a utopia too. Yeah. But but there's also this idea that without it, it becomes like, हाँ ठीक है, तुझे जो करना है तू कर, मुझे जो करना है मैं करूँगा. So the question of value, or what is it that we value as society, becomes something that becomes kind of not important. That's all. Yeah.
But but the situation
we have to be playful with the idea of the manifesto. We can't be we can't be like manifesto and like हमने अभी जान दे दूंगी इस manifesto के, ऐसे नहीं. We have to be playful about manifestos. Understand that all manifestos are provisional. They are not absolute.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking that the situationists had the exact similar argument as to against the whole kind of Siam and those kind of manifestos, that why should we what is this shit, right? And I walk out of my house and I experience life, okay, and that has nothing to do with the fact that and why do you then need to tell me that that work has to happen there and this has to happen there and this is to happen? I'm a free person. This is life. This is and then that developed into an idea.
But that's also manifesto.
But that's also manifesto.
Yeah.
Okay, that created a manifesto.
Yeah.
So,
but Nishanti, did you have anything in particular that you had in mind when you were discussing the dystopia?
Yeah.
No, I was just thinking about like the kind of media that gets popular today. I mean, I was thinking about like the cyberpunk genre as a whole, and like how we kind of perceive, and also I mean like how I guess with the dying down of the industrial revolution and the rapid rate of technology being discovered, the rate of manifestos could have, I mean like maybe that decline could have also been traced by the manifestos that way. And the utopia.
Yeah. But we'll arrive upon some of these post-industrial sorts of ideas about ideal cities as well. But it's a good thing to keep in mind the idea of the idea of the utopian. What is the utopian? What relevance does it have today? What is when we are designing something, even in because actually the architecture design studio is an ideal sort of testing ground for this. A simple thing. What was the project? कुछ नहीं. Project was तू decide कर तुझे किसके लिए क्या बनाना है तेरे neighborhood में, बस. ठीक है. Now with every single one of the decisions you made after that, you were aiming to intervene to make something better.
Yeah.
Did you ask yourself as to why do you think that is better?
Yeah.
What is the utopian that you had? What is the utopian impulse of your project? Not what is the utopia of your project. What is the desire of your project to make lives better? What are you heading towards? Why do we choose certain value systems and not others? Right? because the choice was up to you, right? You could decide that I want to work with women, I want to work with, I don't know, whoever. Why did you choose those? You are deeply, all of us as architects are deeply implicated in the choices that we make. We write ourselves every time we kind of make a choice.
Yeah.
It's important to be aware of that and not imagine that it comes out of like some emptiness. Your class gets played out in the choices you're making, your gender, sexuality, caste, all get played out in the choices that you make. Your histories get played out in the choices that you make. And that is very apparent in all these people that we saw today. They all came from an upper bourgeois class. They all kind of had a certain access to education. Their value systems were deeply embedded by where and who they were, the societies that they grew up in. Therefore, their ideas of what they call better, what they call beautiful was enabled and circumscribed. It allowed as well as this didn't allow. Okay, they were enabled and circumscribed by the gender, caste, etc., positions that they occupied. Does that make them less valuable or more valuable? I don't know, but they are valuable for us to think about. It allows a conversation for us to think about who we are, what is this desire that we have for betterness, why is that better for us? And most importantly, who as architects, how do we choose to participate in the world? I didn't say who. How do we choose to participate in the world? I'm not assuming that you're making buildings. I'm not assuming that you're making law. I'm not assuming that you're dancing. I'm not assuming anything. I'm only saying that as an architect, one thing architects have to do is that to make lives better through spatial practices. Simple, no? So therefore, as architects, how do we choose to participate in making the world better, making spaces better?
Rohan, this is a very difficult question because they are in a space where they are expected to demonstrate their abilities to design and build. And they are within the program that mandates or that sort of regulates us to get them to do that. Okay.
Absolutely.
So that questioning is actually throughout this system, right? It's not limited only to say Nishanti or you or me. I mean, it's asking questions of which are much sort of which should be debated ideally, which should be spoken about. And at least what is the engagement then between us and society? I mean, maybe that's the question. That's the question. How do we engage? How do we engage with society? What is our medium of engagement? Like Nishanti is saying, media, which was a medium of engagement, today is on another trip altogether, right? That mode of engagement is strange, especially in this kind of space. We are all in media space right now, continuously through the Teams or everything. So I'm finding that a very intriguing question. I don't have the answer. Sorry. I mean, I'm not.
There is no answer. I don't think there can be an answer. I think this idea of answers also is a thing. No, we are hoping for finality, like as if this has been resolved and it's over. चलो आगे चलते हैं. ऐसे तो है नहीं ना. Some things are kind of existential. They are part of being. You can't.
But Ron, one thing I'm definitely thinking is that would you rewrite your utopias? You know, not invent new, but would you change your existing? I'm thinking of the Constitution, for example. I'm thinking of things which are what do you say? You're born into it. You know.
I think you do because I think depending on how you learn or depending on your I mean that way Hindu Rashtra is a utopia. Yeah. That is very directly kind of against the constitutional imagination of the subcontinent. No, it's another utopian imagination that comes from another history, that comes from another kind of background, another value system itself, which you or me or somebody in the class may or may not agree with, but there are many people who probably will, and they come with that idea very much as deeply embedded in the making of architecture. The Ayodhya temple, for example, it's part of the building of Hindu Rashtra, which is, I mean, it's there. Sarthak had a question. I think Sarthak raised his hand.
Yeah, you said about choices in the process of design. So I was really wondering that when we are at this stage where where there are two ways, like something that you deeply want to do and something that is a great opportunity for exposure and exploration. So I'm really confused that what should one do and where should one harness his himself or her
No, that's
in
also a
such.
good question. No, it's a good question because that is something that we are constantly stuck with, no? That we are finally as a profession or as individuals, we are part of things like families, and we are part of uh, social structures and apartment buildings and nations and communities, and we are all of these things. And with each of those, our identities of who we are is not completely like we were saying earlier. At one point, me being a son enables me, but in other ways, it's also circumscribes me. It doesn't enable me. So we are always, all our identities are always negotiating this relationship between who I am and what society expects me to be. And I'm always performing that kind of space playfully, sometimes self-consciously, sometimes with great trauma. And I think all of us do that automatically, that we are always negotiating our true selves, whatever our true selves are. I don't even know that whether that idea of the true self exists. But nevertheless, by who we think we are with who other people think we should be. And the same thing goes even for the act of architecture, and even more so for architecture, because architecture is fundamentally working with others. It's, you're building not only for yourself, no? You're building for society. And as soon as you say you're building for society, you're performing in society, and there are value systems and systems of structures, etc., that do exist in the world that are going to circumscribe your so-called freedom. So that negotiation between the self and the other becomes even more kind of prominent within the act of architecture. So the important thing for us is to not pretend to be one or the other. That is what to say, that not to say that यार बाकी का society को छोड़ मैं मेरा creativity display करूँगा क्योंकि मैं बहुत genius type हूँ. Okay, because then whatever that you're doing, you're only talking about yourself. That is not architecture, and that is not architecture's responsibility. That is kind of self-fulfilling कि मैं तो cool हूँ, मुझे, it's like looking into a mirror and admiring your own haircut. That's all it is. On the other hand, it should not also be the other way around, that you are saying that मैं कौन हूँ, मैं तो कुछ नहीं हूँ, जो सोसाइटी बोलेगा मैं वही करूँगा. सोसाइटी ने डिसाइड किया है ना कि आर्किटेक्ट सिर्फ ये करता है, तो मैं करूँगा, क्योंकि मैं तो हूँ ही नहीं ना. मैं जो भी हूँ, मैं सोसाइटी ने जो डिसाइड किया है मेरे लिए, मैं वो हूँ. That is the other stupidity, because in that case you are acting as if you have no identity. So the trick here is actually to be able to juggle these identities and to be able to negotiate between these different identities, so that one is able to be true, okay, to what you want to perform as, not what you are, because I am many things. I can't be true to myself like that, because I can be like, all these different truths will constantly collide with each other. Me as a son and me as a kind of fan of I don't know, Bruce Springsteen. Okay, these are not necessarily compatible. My mother hates rock music, let's say, but yet I have to manage that, na? I'll manage it because I love Bruce Springsteen and I love my mother. So these are all negotiations that we have to figure out. So I think that it's important to be true to whom you want to perform yourself to be for a given situation. And as long as you are, you have an integrity to that search, an integrity to that particular moment, I think that itself is of value. Does that vaguely answer your question? or at least begin to answer? Sarthak.
Yeah. Yeah, it made some things clear.
Cool. Should we kind of
I
Nishant?
had one last comment. Sorry.
Sure.
I have always found this one term very misleading. Ki, you are, I am going to design for the society essay. So there are thesis projects upon migrant workers, upon women empowerment, etc., etc. But so this holiday after the second year, I looked into what these tenders by the government are, and I found out that these are those. So you need to have some experience in a 100 CR project to actually enter in that thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know, मतलब वो opportunity मेरे को मिलेगा ही नहीं. That is the one thing, unless I have experience of working before. So that is a term I find it totally misleading.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true actually.
you're right. You're right, Sarthak. This is by the way, anybody who has worked on government projects, especially, or gotten close to it, or with organizations, this is the fundamental kind of sort of line which actually throws your proposal out of the window. ठीक है, simple. Okay, नहीं है 100 करोड़ नहीं है तेरा तो तू क्वालिफाई नहीं होता. Okay, तेरा प्रोजेक्ट कितना भी अच्छा होगा, तेरा इमेजिनेशन अच्छा होगा, तेरा एबिलिटी होगा टू एग्जीक्यूट, लेकिन 100 करोड़ का टर्नओवर नहीं है, आउट.
Now these are really places where the Council of Architecture should be making more of a stand, setting up criteria, setting up kind of systems of judgment. But somehow I don't know, and maybe it tries also. I don't really know much about the council because I don't know anyone in the council. But really, that is what the Council of Architecture is meant to do.
But Rohan, this is also a problem of how we participate in the democratic process, huh? Because I don't think that, I mean, we have created created the council is there for us, and we think that the council is the way by which we get our democratic voice into the system. But unfortunately, it is not. It is an institutional system. Okay, it has its own kind of structures, limitations, as we all know. But there is an active democratic process which we have completely sort of stayed away from. Yeah. So democracy cannot work only in the top down. If the signals don't go up, and who are the signals? Okay, if you're not signaling, somebody else is signaling, right? And so I feel that there's that issue also. I mean, if you're not able to generate enough signaling, if that's an issue, are we participating in the democratic process of raising that as an issue with our we don't even know who our sort of representatives are. So we are in an incredibly amazing utopian place, actually.
Dystopian.
Sorry, Nishanti. Dystopian.
One person's utopia is another person's dystopia.
Yeah. सोच साहब, क्या करेगा तू? कुछ तो करना पड़ेगा तेरे को. ऐसा नहीं
करेगा. अभी तो थर्ड ईयर में तो पहुंच गया. अभी 5 साल तो खत्म कर तो करना ही है ना. उसके बाद तो नो चॉइस. डील विद इट.
प्रोजेक्ट बिल्ड करने का है ना, लेकिन कहीं जाके.
The life you chose, my friend.
प्रोजेक्ट को बिल्ड करने का है. Very interesting. Yeah, somebody saying something.
Lean close, so I thought you had something to say. Dhriti has shared something in the window. What is that, Dhriti?
Oh, it's a PDF. Thanks so much. Yeah. Spaces of Hope. Thanks, Dhriti.
Yeah. That's what it was.
Very nice.
Anyway, thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.
Go back to your landscape studio tomorrow, no?